Nobody hands you a mower and expects you to end up owning anything. You certainly didn't. You make $15 an hour keeping weeds down on lots. Nobody's built on yet for a property management company that owns more empty dirt than it knows what to do with. It is 7 in the morning. You're standing on a half-acre lot behind a shuttered gas station, engine idling, and this particular patch of grass has no owner watching it, no tenant using it, nothing happening on it at all, except you cutting grass for a company that forgot it existed. 2 miles across town, a different vacant lot you also mow is running a paid weekend parking operation on a cardboard sign and a lockbox, clearing $600 a month for doing nothing but sitting there empty. You know the number because you built the spreadsheet. Nobody at the property company and nobody on your crew has any idea you're the one collecting it, and you've spent 2 years making sure it stays exactly that way. Your supervisor thinks you're saving for a truck. Your girlfriend thinks you just like mowing more lots than you're assigned. Neither of them is wrong exactly. They just don't know what 9 leased lots actually add up to, or where you really go on Saturday mornings before your shift even starts, standing in an empty gravel lot listening to a card reader beep for the 3rd time before 8 a.m., because to you by now it is completely normal. This isn't a story about a shortcut, and it isn't a story about luck. It's a story about a groundskeeper who kept asking who actually owned the dirt he was mowing, and what happened over 2 ordinary years once he stopped assuming the answer belonged to somebody else. It starts with a guy named Marcus, who ran the north side of the mowing route for the same property company. He was 34, drove a truck older than the company itself, and always had a spare padlock rattling around his glove box. One slow Thursday he mentioned, the same way he'd mentioned the weather, that he leased the corner lot on 5th to a food truck operator for $200 a month. You laughed, assuming he meant the company paid him a bonus for it. He said no. He leased it, had for about a year, and the food truck guy paid him directly, cash on the 1st of every month. You asked how a groundskeeper ends up leasing land he doesn't own. He said the same way anybody ends up leasing anything. He found the actual landowner, not the property management company, and asked a question nobody else had bothered asking. He told you the lot wasn't even the interesting part. The interesting part was that he'd mowed that same corner for 8 months before he ever looked up who owned it, assuming, the way most people assume, that a vacant lot belongs to whoever's paying to have it mowed. It took him one afternoon at the county records office to find out the real owner was a retired dentist 2 towns over who didn't even remember she still had it. That detail changed something in you. It meant the lot wasn't hidden behind some complicated ownership structure or a company too big to reach. He was just an ordinary person who'd stopped paying attention, and Marcus was the first person who'd bothered to notice. You couldn't stop thinking about the shape of it. A vacant lot doesn't need a store built on it to make money. It doesn't call in sick, and it doesn't care who's parked on it as long as somebody's paying. You started pulling up county parcel records for every lot on your route, cross-referencing owner names against actual mailing addresses, looking for the pattern Marcus had described. Out of 41 lots you mowed regularly, 6 were owned by someone who didn't live within 50 miles of the property, the exact profile of an owner who'd forgotten what they were sitting on. You did rough math on a napkin between mowing stops.
A gravel lot near the fairgrounds, rented out for event parking 8 weekends a year at $40 a car, 20 spots, was $6,400 a year before you'd even touched a weekday lease.
The math kept coming out real, no matter how conservative you made the assumptions, and that was the part that actually scared you, because it meant the only thing standing between you and doing this yourself was you. You started reading everything you could find about ground leases, temporary use permits, and liability insurance for unpermitted parking, not the dream version, but the boring legal reality of it. Every question you answered produced 3 more, and instead of discouraging you, it did the opposite. You spent an evening at the library learning the difference between a temporary use permit and a full site plan, and discovering that plenty of cities let a vacant lot run as informal parking or storage for up to a year without either one, as long as nobody filed a complaint. That single fact alone was worth more than everything else you'd read combined. You had $3,100 saved, mostly from 2 years of picking up extra mowing routes nobody else wanted. Marcus didn't hand you a shortcut, only a name, and even that took a month of you asking before he gave it up, mostly because he wanted to see if you'd actually follow through. He introduced you to the retired dentist, a woman named Ruth who owned 4 separate vacant lots scattered around the county and hadn't thought about any of them in years beyond the mowing invoice she paid quarterly. Her worst lot, a half-acre of cracked asphalt behind an old auto shop, was sitting completely empty, and she agreed to a 5-year ground lease for $200 a month, payable directly to her, no broker, no company in between. You signed the lease at her kitchen table, on a form you found online and had a lawyer friend glance at for $80, and drove home holding the rights to a parking lot you'd mowed for a paycheck 100 times, without ever once thinking of it as yours to use. Ruth's lease wasn't complicated. 4 pages, a monthly rent number, and a clause letting either side walk with 90 days' notice. That clause kept you up more nights than the actual work did. But it also meant a 26-year-old groundskeeper with no real estate license and no capital worth mentioning could control a piece of land outright, something that would have taken years and a bank's blessing any other way. Ground leases being, as Ruth put it, for people who actually ask instead of assuming somebody already has it handled. You kept a copy of that lease folded in your glove box for the first 3 months, pulling it out to reread the 90-day clause more times than you'd ever admit, as if rereading it might make the arrangement feel less like it could vanish overnight. The first few months nearly broke you. Someone dumped a truckload of construction debris on the lot in week 3, an $1,100 cleanup you didn't have, so you hauled half of it yourself in your own truck bed to cut the bill in half. You drove out before every mowing shift to check for illegal dumping, and again after, on maybe 5 hours of sleep most nights. A neighboring business tried to claim the lot as informal overflow parking for free, which meant 2 sleepless weeks of phone calls and a hand-lettered sign explaining otherwise. You kept the lease. Income that first summer landed around $300 a month after cleanup costs and a cheap chain-link gate, barely more than pocket change for what felt like a second full-time job's worth of stress. There was a specific Tuesday in August, 94 degrees, hauling a truck bed of broken concrete by hand with your real shift starting in 90 minutes, when you sat in your truck and genuinely considered handing the keys back to Ruth. You didn't. You bought a $40 padlock and a real gate instead, chained it properly, and stopped the dumping problem for good with 11 minutes to spare before your shift. Nobody teaches you that the difference between people who control land and people who don't is sometimes just whoever was willing to haul concrete for 1 more hour than felt reasonable. Getting basic liability coverage on land you didn't technically own took 4 phone calls and 1 thoroughly confused insurance agent before you found someone willing to actually write the policy, and it ended up costing less than a single weekend of parking revenue to carry for the entire year. The turn came in month 6 when you finally stopped doing everything yourself. You paid a local teenager $30 a week to check the gate and empty the lockbox twice a week, which sounds small until you realize it bought back 5 hours of your life. You added a card reader kiosk next to the gravel entrance, and cashless parkers turned out to pay for the full day almost every time, because nobody thinks twice about tapping a card for $6. By month 8, the lot was clearing $700 a month, more than double where it started, and you hadn't raised the price once. You had just stopped bleeding money and hours on things the system could handle instead of you standing there. That lesson turned out to matter more than any single lease you ever signed. The side income that depends entirely on you showing up in person is really just a second job wearing a landlord's clothes. The moment the lot could run a full week without you physically standing there checking the gate was the moment it actually started being an asset instead of a very demanding hobby. You wrote that down in the same notebook you'd used for the original napkin math because it felt worth remembering the next time you were tempted to do everything yourself again. You listed the empty lot on 2 local classifieds groups almost as an afterthought, and within a week, a moving company started paying for overnight truck parking $60 a month for income that required nothing from you beyond approving a message on your phone. Ruth called you 5 months later, ready to lease 2 more of her lots at once, since she liked not thinking about them anymore. You used the first lot's own income as proof it worked, and negotiated both new leases at a lower rate than the first, since Ruth now trusted you to actually maintain them properly. By the 1-year mark, you controlled 4 lots. By year 2, 9. You learned to spot a good vacant lot from the mowing route before you even pulled county records, checking for street visibility, checking whether nearby businesses ran out of parking on weekends, learning that a lot near a stadium or fairground could out-earn 3 ordinary lots combined on event days alone. None of it required a real estate license. It required doing the same 3 or 4 things correctly, over and over, at a slightly larger scale each time. Each new lease got a little less terrifying and a little more procedural. You built a simple checklist you ran before ever approaching an owner: absentee mailing address, county tax records showing no development, permits filed, visible from a road with real traffic, and a rough head count of nearby businesses that might need overflow parking. Marcus once told you the owners who never called you back were usually either already leasing it quietly to someone else or hiding a title problem, and it was rarely worth the time finding out which. You also learned, more slowly, which owners to walk away from entirely, the ones who wanted a percentage of revenue instead of a flat rent, because a percentage deal meant opening your books to a stranger every month, and flat rent meant you both knew exactly where you stood. The closest call came when your property management supervisor drove past the auto shop lot on a Saturday and noticed a hand-painted parking sign with a phone number he didn't recognize, on land the company itself mowed under contract. He mentioned it Monday morning, mildly curious, asking if you knew anything about it since it was on your route. You said you'd look into it, heart going flat in your chest, and spent the rest of that shift with your stomach in your throat every time his truck passed. He never connected the phone number to you. But you drove home that night with your hands actually shaking on the wheel, and it was the first time you seriously asked yourself whether you could keep doing both things without one eventually finding out about the other. You thought about it for most of the drive past the corner lot where Marcus first mentioned the food truck, and came to the same answer you'd come to a dozen times since. The mowing job wasn't a secret you were protecting out of shame. It was just the last quiet, simple part of a life that had otherwise gotten complicated, and you weren't ready to give it up just because the other half had nearly caught up to it. You spent the rest of that week rehearsing an explanation you never actually had to give, a version of the truth, vague enough to satisfy a supervisor and specific enough to sound believable if it ever came to that, and needing one at all told you something about how far this had quietly gone. 9 lots now, 3 counties, 1 part-time gate manager, and a landscaper on call for the 2 lots you still let sit as informal green space. The mowing job still pays $15 an hour. Your leased lots cleared just under $51,000 in income last year, after every gate repair, every insurance premium, every slow month where nobody wanted to park anywhere. You could quit the mowing route tomorrow. You haven't. And it isn't fear anymore, not really. It's routine and it's cover. And if you're honest, some mornings the mower is the only quiet 40 minutes you get before the rest of the day starts moving. Your gate manager, a steady former landscaper named Sam, handles the actual day-to-day now, the lockbox checks, the gate repairs, the small disputes that used to be yours to settle at 8 at night. You still drive past every lot yourself once a week, not because you need to, but because standing on a piece of ground you control, checking a lock the way Marcus once taught you to check one, is the closest thing you have left to the version of this that used to feel impossible. You keep 3 separate folders now, one for leases, one for insurance, one for tax records, because the version of you who signed that first lease at Ruth's kitchen table never once imagined needing any of them, let alone all 3 at once. Marcus left the company last spring, not to retire, just to manage his own 6 lots full-time instead of mowing anyone else's. You went to his last day and didn't say much, just watched him joke with people who still think he spent 3 years mowing grass and nothing else. Somebody that day asked what Marcus was going to do now that he didn't need the mowing paycheck anymore, and he said the truest thing you'd heard in months, that he'd stopped needing it a long time ago. He just hadn't needed anyone to know it. He thought about that the whole drive home, past the corner lot, past the auto shop lot you signed with Ruth for $200 a month and a shaking hand, past every lease since, and understood for the first time that none of this was ever really about the money sitting in the account. It was about the exact moment you stopped needing the mowing job to be the whole story, even while you kept showing up for your shift the next morning like nothing had changed at all. Somewhere on your route tonight, a gate is locked on a lot that's making money in the dark whether anyone's watching it or not. Nobody on your crew has any idea what that gate actually means. That was always the whole point. Marcus texts you sometimes, pictures of a lot he just picked up near a new stadium going in, grinning like a man who finally found something he didn't know he was allowed to want. You texted back one line: check the mailing address before you check anything else. It's the only advice that's ever actually mattered. None of it started with a plan. It started with a guy on the other side of the route mentioning the food truck lease the same way he'd mentioned the weather, and you being tired enough or curious enough to actually pull the county records instead of laughing it off and going back to your mowing schedule. Most people hear a story like Marcus's and file it away as something that happened to somebody else, a decent story for a slow shift, and go right back to cutting the same 41 lots. A few people go home and open the county records website. That's the entire difference, and it was always smaller and stranger and more available than anyone standing behind a mower at 7 in the morning would ever guess. If this kind of quiet arithmetic is your kind of story, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs exactly nothing, which is the best price this channel knows. A new one arrives tomorrow. Same time, same desk, different machine.